Hannibal, anything at the end?
Yes, we sure will. A number of really exciting developments happening here on the Hannibal TV on YouTube. And this is the return of the Fan Forum, the opportunity for you to interact with the Hannibal TV, myself, and most importantly, the godfather of Hannibal TV himself, Hannibal. Before we throw to Hannibal, I just wanted to say that if you haven't subscribed to this channel, you're going to want to, because there's lots of good stuff in the mix, and we'll touch on a new development during the course of this show. But here we are to talk about the greatest professional wrestling managers of all time. And before we get into the list and how it was compiled, as I mentioned, the godfather of the Hannibal TV, here is Hannibal himself.
Yeah, and we are going to try something new, and we'll talk about this briefly now. We do have some channel members here on the Hannibal TV, and after we're done this fan discussion, for the first time ever, we're going to do a members only podcast for our the Hannibal TV members that pay a couple of dollars a month to help support the channel. So for this one, we're going to pretty much let them ask whatever they want. But let's get into this manager. We had a fan vote to decide who was going to do this, or what the topic was going to be. Over 200 people voted, and greatest managers was by far, not by far, it just beat out Road Warriors versus Demolition, who was better. So they'll be back on there for a future fan discussion. But let's get into it. I'll let you lead the way there, gentleman Jack Kilby.
Well, yeah, it was a topic that I think was going to win ultimately because of the nostalgia associated with the manager. And you know what? In today's product, we have very very few, at least in terms of the WWE and AEW to a lesser extent. But we're talking about the golden era of professional wrestling and those managers that stand out as an enhancement to the product and really became legends themselves, a number of which are on this list. Now, I should preface it by saying that we took a look at their influence historically, mic skills, their most important facet, I would say, of the manager back in the day was the ability to elevate talent. Some which we'll talk about, certainly did that. Others not so much, but their general contribution to the product as a whole. Now, this is not a scientific list. There's no, we're not going to be going in any particular order, but I think Hannibal and I have a definite agreement of opinion as to who the greatest of all time was, and we'll get to that. But want to start with a man that maybe some of the younger fans aren't really familiar with, but he really, in terms of the history of the business, made a significant impact. And I would be talking about the man known as the Grand Wizard of Wrestling. His real name was Ernie Roth. He was a fixture in the 70s in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He had bombastic promos. He had a very unique look about him with sequin jackets, turban, oversized sunglasses. And he was perhaps most known for guiding the career of the superstar Billy Graham to his world championship opportunities, as well as Greg Valentine. And he really elevated talent that he was with. Hannibal, I know you were a great friend of the superstar and had an opportunity to talk about his relationship with the Grand Wizard. What can you share with the fans on that?
He personally did not like having the Grand Wizard as a manager because he wanted to do his own talking. So they did get along, but there wasn't really, I mean, obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, the Grand Wizard was a homosexual guy. He lived a certain type of lifestyle. So it's not like Billy Graham was hanging out with this guy outside of the ring, and there he wasn't in those days. The manager a lot of the time would just walk the guy to the ring and not necessarily even do anything in the match. And he certainly wouldn't. A lot of the time, too, as with the Grand Wizard, he wouldn't actually appear on the smaller events, so he wouldn't have been on the road with Billy all the time. But I know he also managed the Sheik as Abdullah Farouk, I believe, and a bunch of famous wrestlers there. But it was before my time. He died October 12th, 1983. So I was pretty much a newborn when he passed away. So all I can say about his relationship with Billy is they weren't close.
Yeah, and that's something that we've heard in reference to other individuals. Notably, comes to mind is Ravishing Rick Rude, who didn't really want to have Bobby the Brain with him as his manager because he felt he had the mic skills and it would take away from his presentation. So I can see where the superstar was coming from, considering he was one of the greatest talkers of all time. We'll get to the Brain in a minute, but next up on the list is one of my favorites from the old school era that really transcended wrestling. One of the early figures to transcend wrestling into pop culture, and of course was well known in his later years for managing the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov and Hulk Hogan before his heel turn. And I would be talking about none other than classy Freddie Blassie, who coined the term pencil neck geeks and really kind of set the template for an over-the-top heel manager in the 80s, and went on to have a career in some television shots, movies, and most famously the Breakfast with Blassie with the late Andy Kaufman, which if you haven't seen it, it's worth a watch. But I know it's a little bit before your time, Hannibal, but what were your thoughts in retrospect on Fred Blassie, a great wrestler too in his heyday?
I did watch that Breakfast with Blassie. At one point, it was on YouTube during YouTube's infancy. I don't think it's still on YouTube. It wasn't the last time I checked for it, but that was very entertaining and ahead of its time. I also enjoyed Freddie Blassie's book where he talks a lot about his wrestling career. As a manager, I mean, I can't tell you. I was never really a fan of him as a manager. He also managed Hulk Hogan as Sterling Golden. I'm not saying he was bad for the era, and certainly Vince McMahon had a big affection for him because they kept him on the payroll for a long time, and he had an office job even for a long time. Where I know you did an interview with a former WWE female employee that basically said he wasn't exactly the most politically correct office job guy, and he didn't seem to really do much. But yeah, I mean, as far as Fred Blassie, I can't tell you. I was never a fan of the Sheik and Volkov, to be honest with you.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, no, I honestly can't. I won't say that the Sheik wasn't a good heel, but I wouldn't put them up there as one of my favorite tag teams. So I'll let you talk about Fred Blassie, and then after that, someone brings up Paul Ellering, so we can jump into that when you're done saying your opinion on Blassie. But I heard he was a great Japanese legend, apparently, and for whatever reason, Vince McMahon and him had a close relationship. Who knows how close? Because we've always heard about apparently Vince McMahon played both sides of the field.
So to speak. Yeah, I mean, I think Blassie made an impression on a really young me because of his voice, his bombastic style, and I remember he was involved in that finish in WrestleMania 1 where the Sheik and Volkov defeated the U.S. Express when Freddie threw the cane and it was used and the titles changed hand. But yeah, I think it's mostly because I, unlike yourself, was a huge fan of Sheik and Volkov, especially the Russian national anthem and the Sheik getting on and uttering his comments at the end. But definitely in his latter years, apparently, according to Deb Jasway, that former creative services director for a long period of time that you talked about, he was a really randy senior citizen, so to speak. But on to Precious Paul Ellerling, a really interesting character in the business who was just recently let go by WWE after managing the Authors of Pain. And I know we might have a little bit of a disagreement on those guys as well, but Paul Ellerling, of course, everybody remembers from managing Hawk and Animal, the Road Warriors, and interestingly enough, was quite an accomplished wrestler in Mid-South prior to, and other locations, of course, AWA, before transitioning to be a manager due to injuries. And at one time had that Legion of Doom stable, which included not only, the Road Warriors, but there were others involved, including Bundy, Jake the Snake Roberts, et cetera, et cetera. But as one fan pointed out here, was an actual shoot manager for Hawk and Animal in terms of managing their finances. And I think really an underrated promo. What are your thoughts on Precious Paul?
I liked him best in the AWA, but I was thinking about it after his last release. He actually had like 3 runs in WWE. His first one, where the Rocco thing was his idea, that was a flop with the Rocco. Then he came back and he managed the Harris twins for one point, which people don't even remember. Then he's had this Authors of Pain run. So it's interesting. As good as he was in AWA, you could argue he was never actually over as a manager in WWE, but there's no doubt his AWA stuff was great. I can't remember if they used him in NWA or not. I
Yes,
think they may have at
extensively.
one point. Yeah. Yeah, because
Yeah.
wasn't he didn't he have a contract or something? And Ric Flair had a problem with it. Now it's coming back to me.
Yeah, he was all over Jim Crockett Promotions. He was even there for the Techwood Drive television tapings with Animal and Hawk. And I think what fans may not remember about Precious Paul was he was really a legit tough guy and had a variety of. He was a great mind financially, and was after he transitioned out of wrestling initially, was involved in the famous dog sled race, the Iditarod. Don't crucify me for my pronunciation, but was really into that. So really interesting character. I think they, especially this last go around, he really added to the AOP package in NXT, but then up on the main roster, I don't think they had him cut a promo or anything like that at all. And I know you thought that they were boring, but I have a hard time not knowing why they couldn't find the use for big tough heels like that with Precious Paul. Seems like a waste.
I'm just sick of people that didn't want to be wrestlers getting the opportunities because like those guys were in other sports and they only got in WWE because they were offered to get paid to train. And when they weren't in WWE, they didn't do anything in wrestling. Then they were brought back after doing nothing. And apparently they were under contract for like a year before they were even used the last run. I don't know if that includes Ellering or not, but they've made a lot of money in wrestling and clearly didn't have the passion for it. So in the old days, they probably wouldn't have even had interest in doing it. Was there potential there? Yes, but they've been around a long time and they never really got to the next level. Who knows if good old Tony Khan will add them because we know Rachel Ellering is in AEW and as you said, Paul Ellering is a businessman. He's probably going like why not? I mean they take WWE rejects all the time and
Very,
those
very
guys
good
are
point.
younger. Yeah, I mean, I would see Paul Ellering at least trying to get them in to AEW at this point.
Considering they get paid often to just sit at home. Speaking of Jim Crockett promotions around the same time frame, this is a guy that I met, and I think you did too, when we were at Cauliflower Alley circa, I think it was 2020, 2019, whenever that was. And a guy who is somewhat of a divisive figure in terms of his performance as a manager. And I would be speaking about J.J. Dillon, of course, the manager of the infamous Four Horsemen, who was the brains behind the Four Horsemen. He was a great fit in there with Ric Flair. His promos were understated, but I always liked the guys that didn't yell and scream all the time, because you saw that a lot. His promos were very, very matter of fact, dripping with arrogance, and he really got the stable over. And it's not hard when you're dealing with not the latter incarnations of the Four Horsemen, but when you got Ole, Arn, Tully, and whoever else the other member would be, Rick, of course. And you swap in Ole in there for Barry Windham. That was also a great version of it. It's hard not to, but I know a guest that I'm going to be interviewing upcoming, a man who's been around for a while, wrestling historian, Dragon King Carl Stern. There's a debate going on about why are Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson not in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. And one of the reasons they cite is because it's Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson with J.J. Dillon. How do you feel about J.J.?
Well, I've done a 3-hour interview with him that I would suggest people watch. Met him numerous times. One weird thing about him, and maybe it's his old age. I had done several interviews with him, and I did run into him a few years ago. And I don't know if he just wanted to make me feel like a nobody or what. But he's like, I don't remember you. I have no idea who you are. Maybe he's go. I found that a little weird. It's like I sat down with you and I did an over 3-hour interview with you, and it wasn't that long ago. How do you not remember that? As far as him, he fit in well with the Four Horsemen. I can't honestly say that I was ever like a fan of his, but he fit in well with that group. His book was interesting. I do. He did. He also had a podcast with John Paz that is on the Hannibal TV. If you search up J.J. Dillon, the Hannibal TV, I really enjoyed his podcast with John Paz. The details he goes into about when he was head of WWE talent relations, really at one of its peaks, like from '88 to I think around the mid '90s, when he then went on to WCW as a talent relation guy. So him as a talent relations official, I actually find very interesting. And he really didn't like Lex Luger. It's very funny. He did not like Lex Luger, because I've seen lots of interviews with him, and anytime Lex Luger's name is brought up, he mentions how difficult Luger used to be to deal with. And I think he holds a grudge over when Luger jumped from WWE to WCW, because I think JJ must have got some heat from that, because he was in charge of talent relations at that time. Bischoff always says that JJ had offered him some information about behind the scenes WWE stuff when he went over to WCW, which Bischoff claims that he refused to get, which doesn't really make sense. Why would you not want to know that? And JJ denies that he was ever giving him that. I hear his health isn't that good. I wish him the best. The interesting thing about JJ, and I think he said this on the record, he actually used to do for his like he seems fairly straight and narrow, but just to show you how crazy the '80s were, he would do drugs and stuff from time to time. He was never an addict or anything, but he admits like he would party, like doing the similar stuff that Tully would do here and there. So I mean, that just goes to show you, wow, in the '80s, even a quote unquote straight and narrow looking guy like JJ would take the partying to another level sometime. But yeah, I respect him for all he did in the business, and by far, I mean, I think the Four Horsemen had what, Hiro Matsuda and maybe Arn Anderson as a manager at one point as well, but JJ by far the best manager of the Four Horsemen in my opinion.
Yeah, after Arn and Tully jumped to WWF, Hiro Matsuda came on and they called it Flair, and Wyndham called it a different name, but it definitely didn't work. But yeah, glad you referenced that interview on the channel. It's excellent, and fans search that up and watch it. The man is a repository of history for sure.
The one thing I will bring up that is disappointing because Charles just brings up JJ being a good heel. Could you imagine? I know Ric Flair didn't supposedly want to leave the Crockett's in '88, but JJ was working backstage in '88 in WWE. They had Anderson and Blanchard. I mean, could you imagine if they had JJ Dillon as a manager? I think as good as Heenan was, and we are going to talk about him, I think JJ would have worked better as a manager for Tully and Arn in WWE in some ways. And man, it's too bad Flair never jumped in '88 and had Dillon, and would have been interesting to see because I think they had Barry Windham in '89 in WWE as the
Yes.
Widowmaker too, so they could have
Yep.
technically had. I mean, that's arguably. I would even say that's the best version of the Horsemen with Barry, Tully, and Arn and JJ. They were all in '89. They were all there, but Flair, who ended up coming anyways. So that's one of those. What if it had happened? Because those were. I know Flair had the Steamboat feud, but really, it would have been interesting to see if he had joined when WWE was more at its peak. Because although it was good in '92 ish when he came over, it was already on the down swing. It wasn't as hot as it was in the '80s at that point.
Yeah, and I think Flair explained why he almost jumped but didn't, because he was such good friends with Jim Crockett and he was being taken care of in terms of pay. But the next guy I want to talk about, a lot of the fans are talking about him in the chat, and that would be Percy Pringle, Paul Bearer. Percy Pringle, a guy that I really enjoyed his work in Texas as a heel manager, managed a number of world class heels. He was kind of at the time got a little bit of criticism as a Bobby Heenan kind of knockoff, but I thought he had his own style. But man, when he became Paul Bearer in 90 or whatever, I might be off by a year, when he debuted and with that mortuary deal and the voice and the makeup and everything, I thought it was a little goofy at the start when he showed up there, because I was Mr. NWA Serious Wrestling at the time. But wow, what a run he had with the Undertaker and later Kane, Mankind, and really became a real memorable cartoonish character. Your thoughts on Percy Pringle, Paul Bearer?
I think Undertaker debuted in November 1990, but it was Brother Love managing him. I think it was at least a month, but Paul Bearer was fairly soon after, so it would be safe to say early '91 or whatever. The one thing I remember is my dad was convinced that Paul Bearer was Brother Love for like a year, and this was before the internet, because he was in those days he didn't even really watch wrestling. But Saturday morning, I'd have lunch and watch WWE superstars and I mean, those were the days. Like everyone watched Saturday morning wrestling, and your dad would sort of watch and be like, "That's Brother Love." His Brother Love was similar weight at that time, had the makeup, and also managed the Undertaker at first, but for whatever reason, they switched it to Paul Bear, which I forget the reason for it. I only liked him as the Undertaker's manager for whatever reason. I didn't like him really managing other people, but Undertaker at that time with Paul Bear as the manager was my favorite wrestler, and I love the whole thing. I do. Here's a little story about Paul Bear that is interesting, and it's too bad they don't have house shows anymore because this stands out to me as a kid from a house show. They were at the Robert Gerting Arena again in that early '90s dead period in wrestling. I think it may have been around '94 or '93, but this was before the show even started. And for anyone that doesn't know, Robert Gertin Arena is like a minor hockey arena in Hull, Quebec, across the bridge from Ottawa. And at that time, they weren't doing good enough to go to a main. People will say Bret Hart was the greatest champion ever, but they weren't doing good enough to go to the big Ottawa arena. So they would go to this 3,000 seats arena in Hull, and they would get like 1,500 people in there. But for whatever reason, before the show, there was a curtain, and this was a short aisle. They were coming out of the curtain like right between the two benches, and the aisle was like 10 or 15 feet long. And Paul Bearer, this is like half an hour before the show, puts his face through the curtain and starts making these crazy faces. Then he takes his face out of the curtain. Then he puts his face back in the curtain. And he did this for like 15 minutes. And the crowd was just going nuts. And he was just, he was just having fun making like weird faces. But the whole crowd was watching. This was maybe half an hour before the show starts. But it's like, that's the thing I remember most about that show. I couldn't even tell you the main event that night, but Paul Bearer making his faces and like popping his head in and out. And then you weren't going to know if he was going to come back, and everyone's looking at the curtain. Then suddenly he comes back, and there he is with another face. It sounds silly, but I just watched the clip of Ricky Starks debuting in NXT a few weeks ago. Not one kid in the crowd. So it's just like brings me back to the time where at this time it was mostly kids watching, and that was over with the kids.
Yeah, he definitely made his mark. He's not on my personal list of favorites. I agree with you. He was by far most effective with the Undertaker, and away from him, I'm not really sure. I just remember one angle where I want to say the Dudley Boys, but somebody killed Paul Bearer. Do you remember that, Hannibal? And they encased him in cement, and then he came back a couple of years later. You remember that?
No, I don't. And that was around the time I stopped being interested in wrestling. Also, the funeral parlor was pretty good. I will
Yeah.
say that
Yes.
I really liked the Brother Love show. I liked Piper's Pit. Then they had the funeral parlor, and then for the longest time they had nothing like that. And I remember that as like the last really good interview segment type thing that they had. Remember when they locked Warrior in the casket? That was a pretty cool moment. I mean, it wasn't nearly as good as the Brother Love show or Piper's Pit, but it was better than King's Court. I think they had King's Court at the same time. It was better than the Body Shop with Jesse Ventura. But yeah, no, those were good times in wrestling. He even did. Here's a piece of trivia. September 9th, 91. Speaking of Ottawa, they did a funeral parlor at a Superstars taping at the Ottawa Civic Center. They taped 3 episodes of the funeral parlor on that, and I remember marking out being there for a funeral parlor taping because, as I said, I was a massive Undertaker fan when he first debuted. I think I was Undertaker for like 3 different Halloweens.
That's awesome. That taping was also where Ric Flair made his debut for in Canada, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, and the main event was no, that was Ric Flair's actual first WWE appearance.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
And then you had and this is strange because at the time, yes, the main event, which was not televised, was Sid defeating The Undertaker in a body bag match. And looking back on it, like you would never think that Sid would beat The Undertaker, but like there, Sid was like going to be the next Hulk Hogan, and everyone thought, and he could have. He just didn't put the effort into it. But like at that time, it's like, yeah, of course Sid is going to beat The Undertaker. But I remember that was a really good match. And God bless Sid, who's passed away, who was managed by Harvey Whippleman, who, to be honest, I never really liked as a manager. But I have interviewed him.
Yeah, he's not on the list, but one person that is, as we get to one of the few, I guess you could say, he doesn't call himself that anymore. He calls himself, I think, an advocate or whatever the deal was in the bloodline. The guy, due to his longevity, has to be on this list is Paul Heyman. Paulie Dangerously. He had a few really excellent runs in the Memphis territory, in the AWA, and of course NWA, WCW, where the Dangerous Alliance was his stable, and then everything that he's done in ECW, too many to mention. That's where I really I'm biased being such a big ECW mark, but I think he really put hardcore wrestling on the map in a more mainstream sort of fashion. But of course, all the younger fans know him as the advocate for Brock Lesnar, and most notably and recently Roman Reigns. I find it interesting that he has expanded his girth approximately 5 times from when he was in the NWA as Paul E. Dangerously. What a great guy on the mic back then, and now. What are your thoughts on Paul Heyman?
I liked him best around that 91 time in WCW when he had the Dangerous Alliance and the Power Hour. Obviously, the ECW promos and stuff were good. I thought he was better then because it was like him fighting the establishment. Now he is the establishment. He's got a lot of power in WWE. Uh, I find him honestly boring now. I I mean, I really find him boring, and I've seen too much of him, and he talks too much. And again, he's not fighting for anything. It's just the establishment guy, and I'm so sick of seeing this bloodline stuff. To me, it's overplayed. I liked him managing Brock Lesnar. He deserves credit for helping get Brock Lesnar over. Uh, but yeah, I liked him back in the Dangerous Alliance time when he was like fighting to get his chance and still on the up. Once he makes the establishment, becomes this big, fat, rich, spoiled guy that has all the control he wants. To me, it's just good for you. You deserve it, but I don't care about him anymore. Actually, someone just made a comment on one of your videos that's kind of interesting. Why are we always talking about stuff that happened in wrestling 30 to 35 years ago? In those days, we were not talking about the 70s or 60s. We were talking about the present, and now we're talking about the past. It's just because the present just isn't that good, and we want to talk about the good times in wrestling. But yeah, nothing against Paul Heyman other than he screwed over a lot of wrestlers and got a pass for it. But he definitely represents the establishment now. He has a very secure position. He definitely lied to a lot of people when he was running ECW. And then ultimately, I mean, he's a great worker because he was acting against WWE all that time and secretly being funded by them.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Hannibal. He was more interesting. You could tell that he was a loose cannon. Certain individuals, their personality translates on camera, and he was one of them. You could tell he was a hothead. He could go off. He did all kinds of interesting things in ECW and the other territories he walked out on. He was a really angry. Well, his initial gimmick was the psycho yuppie, and I found that to be much more entertaining than this walrus like individual that we see on TV now. No disrespect to him. He's a multi-millionaire. It'd be nice if he took some of that money and paid off some of the ECW talents that he still owes money for, including I think you've interviewed one of my favorites many times, the franchise Shane Douglas. Does he not owe Shane still in the neighborhood of $66,000 with interest?
I don't know, but yeah, you have a good point. This walrus type character where he gives a lot of monologues and it's overproduced. Like to me, all these segments that he's in now are just so overly produced. And then the line, "Oh, excuse me, my name is Paul Heyman," and the crowd says it with him. It's just like this is boring as hell to me. I like when he's like fighting the establishment or representing all these young future stars, pushing to get them over. But at this point, If I never saw him, I mean, he's the best manager there is now. For whatever that's worth, by far, I'll give him that. But there is no good managers these days, and they don't really have managers overall. So yeah, I'll give him that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll move on to the first female on the list. I think we could probably I'll talk about Sensational Sherry first. I thought she was an amazing talent, both in the ring and as a manager, would get physically involved, shrill, really a presence at ringside. I first came across Sherry in the AWA when she was the women's champion there, and managing a great tag team, in my opinion, Buddy Rose and Doug Summers. Those matches against the Midnight Rockers in the Showboat, especially the Blood Fest. I mean, really great stuff. Then, of course, managed Shawn Michaels, Ted DiBiase, Randy Savage, Harlem Heat, Ric Flair, on and on and on. But she was put over by a lot of the male wrestlers by saying she was never afraid to get physically involved in the matches, and would bump. Real tough woman. And then I guess Miss Elizabeth too, simply for the fact that she was there during that true pinnacle of pro wrestling, the golden age, managing Macho Man and all the great angles that occurred with Macho Man and her, and of course with Hulk Hogan, the Mega Powers. So a lot of people remember Elizabeth fondly, but in my opinion, Sherry was the better talent.
Yeah, I would say, in my opinion, you'd have to put Elizabeth, Sunny, and Sherry in the top females. With, I guess I would even put Missy Hyatt up there if you want to do a Mount Rushmore. And I don't like Sunny, but she was definitely over like crazy, and she was talented as a manager. Sherry, I saw her. I remember the first wrestling match I ever saw. The main event live was Beefcake against Macho Man with Sherry. She was over. And I remember, like, even outside of wrestling, like when I was first becoming a wrestling fan, like if people would be like, "Oh, you watch wrestling? What do you think of Scary Sherry?" Like people would just bring up Scary Sherry. Like she was over like crazy in those late 80s days of wrestling. I think her demons got to her in WCW, but her promos were great. One of my favorite matches, by far my favorite match, and my favorite Shawn Michaels match of SummerSlam 92 was Shawn Michaels against Rick Martel with Sensational Sherry. That was a great match, and the whole interactions with Sherry was phenomenal. By far, that I loved that match. I watched it a lot, and the whole Sherry played a big role in getting Shawn Michaels over.
Yes.
Would he have got over as much as he did without Sensational Sherry? I mean, she played a big role in it, and it sounds like she was a horrible mother.
Mm.
A dark side of the ring, just a terrible mother. God bless her poor kid who, I mean, he's hanging
Wasn't
in
that
there.
sad?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's as good as a manager that she was, it doesn't sound like she was a great person. And she was definitely on a laundry list of stuff, but 100%. It sounds like she was one of those heel. Sometimes you can say, well, a heel is really nice in real life.
Mm.
Sometimes the baby faces are actual the dicks, but I would say Sherry. It seems like she was a legitimate heel in real
Mm.
life, and there recently a picture that came out of Sherry in one of Ric Flair's robes. So, is she
Saw
one of
that.
the 10,000 of Ric Flair's conquest? Who knows? But I was entertained by her. She was great. And it's too bad she fell victim to the demons of the wrestling business. But there's somebody, honestly, and this is why just wrestling will never be the same with all of her issues and stuff. she's one of those people that couldn't have done any job but wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
Like it
Mm-hmm.
suited her perfectly, but she was so like wild, she really couldn't have done anything else. But
Mm-hmm.
nowadays they want to hire such corporate people and let's these past university athletes and all this. It's like she just would never have made it in WWE, and she has so many demons that they wouldn't have given her the chance, but she would have. She's just one of those legends that just never would even have got the chance in this current era of wrestling. But she's the sad thing is all these and I know people are sick of me saying this every podcast, but they're so spoiled and overpaid now. She's one of the ones that built wrestling to allow them to have this and didn't get to experience the fruits of her labor, sadly.
Yeah, it's that Dark Side of the Ring was perhaps the saddest, and that's saying something from the last season. It was probably the saddest episode. What a downer. Yeah, she definitely had her demons and perhaps her priorities screwed up. But if we can separate the performer from the actual person, I think that's best in many ways in wrestling. Moving on to, I'd be remiss if I left this guy off the list. He's a very polarizing figure, but he continuously comes up in terms of the work that he did getting tag team wrestling over and the art of managing a tag team and that promo that few can forget from Jim Crockett Promotions, especially when he was talking a mile a minute, quite successful today in the podcasting realm, and I would be talking about none other than Jim Cornette, who there's some recent talk about him either coming back to work for WWE or being inducted in the Hall of Fame. In 2017, he was instrumental in getting the Rock and Roll Express in. I honestly can respect his accomplishments with the Midnight Express and that heel manager archetype, but and of course in Smoky Mountain Wrestling he had the Heavenly Bodies, et cetera, et cetera. But he seemed to have a very brief window as an active manager, starting in Memphis, going into Mid South, and then the NWA, and then he was pretty much out of that. So just strictly in terms of being a manager, do you think he belongs in all the lists that he pops up on?
He's a good heel. He's good at getting heat. I can't say I ever liked the Midnight Express. The guy I was the biggest fan of that he managed was Vader. And I can't say that honestly. As much as I love Tom Pritchard, I wasn't a Heavenly Bodies fan. So I can't personally. I can tell you he's a good heel, good talker, good manipulator. Um, Definitely good old school guy that knows how to work people. That's pretty much all I gotta say about him. He certainly has his fans, but was I a fan of his personally? No, but do I deny that he is a great heel and a great worker? No. I don't think he was as good of a booker as people say, though. I'll truly say that his company would still be in business if it was so good. And at the time, he was helping book WWE with the Goon and Alex Porto, TL Hopper, bringing back the new NWA stuff. I don't know.
That was
Those were some
terrible.
low. Yeah, there was some bad times there. But yeah, he's a great heel. He knows how to get heat. But for whatever reason, he didn't manage anyone. At the time he liked Vader, they weren't using Vader well, and it was sadly just angering as a Vader fan. That whole Shawn Michaels feud. That was a time where I really hated WWE and was more of a WCW fan.
Yeah, I before we leave Cornette, I agree with you 100% about his booking. That's probably a bit overrated, but hats off to him for trying to revive a territory in Smoky Mountain. They had some good moments. I think swimming against the tide for sure, and understandably it went out of business. But we'll see if he does get that nod for the Hall of Fame and join Paul Heyman. Next is a guy that some people think belongs on the list, others don't. I personally think he's great, and I will be talking about Jimmy Mouth of the South Heart, first family of wrestling in Memphis, and of course, what a run he had in a WWF managing the Rougeaus, about 100 individuals, rhythm and blues, and of course, as a veteran of Great North Wrestling, and still one of the best shoot interviews out there. It's a shame he doesn't do it today. The greatest intercontinental champion of all time, the Honky Tonk Man. I thought Jimmy really added to that package. And of course, the megaphone with the Hart Foundation and all the finishes that were possible as a result of him being there with that megaphone. Do you agree that Jimmy belongs on the greatest of all time list?
He was good. Did a great job with the Rougeaus. I think sadly the stuff with Hulk Hogan and stuff kind of mars his legacy because he's terrible as a good guy manager as far as he's so boring, and it's like people don't remember him as the heel manager in WWE when he was so good. Because even WCW, it was like he was collecting a paycheck. Like I can't think of anything really great that he did in WCW. Even managing the Nasty Boys was good in WWE. He was definitely did some great stuff during that WWE run. He's an extremely good politician and one of Hulk Hogan's closest friends, but yeah, I just hate seeing like his last stuff just standing there like a zombie waving the American flag. He never says anything with Hulk Hogan or anything. He used to be so good, but I mean, he's what, 80 something now? I mean, he's at the
80.
end of his run. Yeah, exactly. So to me, I mean, he hasn't done anything good in recent decades, but he also wrote some good songs like Crank It Up. I think he helped write the Rougeau Brothers song, wrote a lot of the WCW stuff. So I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame or anything. I'm just saying I'm not a fan of his recent stuff with kind of you remember the last thing somebody does. So it's like all the great entertaining stuff is kind of marred by some of the more recent boring years that he's done to me.
I find it amazing that Jimmy is still on the road as much as he is. He comes to Canada all the time and appears he's got an appearance coming up close to where I am in the greater Kingston area in March, a signing deal, et cetera, et cetera. And the man's 80 years old. I mean, hats off for that. But yeah, that appearance with Hulk Hogan was not good.
Barbara, I'll just say I agree with you. Harley was Vader's best manager. He was also Lex Luger's best manager. So I will definitely put Harley Race up there. As far as Harley Race was a better manager in WCW than Jimmy Hart was, as far as
Yes,
being relevance.
yes, yeah. That's too bad he didn't have a longer tenure there. I think he also managed Mr. Hughes in WCW, but got into some legal problems that resulted in his termination, I believe.
Yeah, I would have been young, but yeah, sadly he didn't have that long of a run there. But Harley's definitely an outlaw.
So we've saved the absolute best for last, but before we get to that individual, just a couple of names that have popped up before on these lists. One being Mr. Fuji, who gets a lot of heat in his. I think he was a better wrestler than he was a manager, actually. But he managed Yokozuna, co-managed with Cornette, managed Demolition, the Powers of Pain, about 1,000 others that I'm forgetting, and he certainly had that Charlie Chan like character, was certainly memorable. one guy that I really like, who I got a hold of his book that, well, actually, it was an audio version of his book that sells for about, I don't know, $2,000 now. It's out of print. Is Gary Hart, Playboy Gary Hart, is a fan of Texas wrestling. Hart had a real understated presence, but really made his mark there as a booker and manager. But in WCW, had that run as Great Muda's manager, Terry Funk's manager, Al Perez. Some people call him boring or whatnot, but I liked his, again, the guys that didn't yell. That and Gary Hart was a legit badass. One of the guys that's passed on that I really would have liked to have done an interview with. And the last guy that everybody talks about is Captain Lou Albano, who was part of that whole rock and wrestling deal when wrestling went mainstream. Had that feud deal with Cyndi Lauper, and managed countless tag teams. Do you remember, before we get to number one, do you remember or have any thoughts on Captain Lou?
Yeah, I'll just say for Gary Hart, I did listen to his book, and my God, that guy puts himself over to a nauseating level in that book. Captain Lou, I mean, he was before my time. I remember, but I do remember all those VHS tapes that you used to be able to get in the video store in the late 80s, early 90s, from that mid 80s era when Lou was a key figure in that Hulk Hogan's rock and wrestling era. Very entertaining guy. Apparently, he was drunk all the time during that period and the earlier period. Again, another one of the characters that just would not. This was the cool. I mean, yes, you can say that. Well, it's more corporate now, and the people are going to live longer. But the Lou Albanos of the world still would have been alive. They just wouldn't have had a job. But like these characters, like Albano, were what made wrestling great because they were just off the wall characters that couldn't have worked anywhere else but the wrestling business. So they were great. He was also in Super Mario Brothers, the
Yeah,
show that in Canada it aired on YTV. I didn't even realize it was him at the time until years later. I think he played a role in getting Cyndi Lauper involved with WWE.
it's because
And
the band was out of him when he played Super. What about that song, that indie rock song, Captain Lou, Captain Lou, Captain Lou? Do you
yeah,
remember that one, Captain
yes,
Lou
I do.
Albano?
And he had a great look. The one thing I will remember, one of the best things, if anyone hasn't seen this, look up the Morton Downey Jr. show with Dave Schultz, Captain Lou's in it, Ted Arcidi. The second one where it was just after the 2020 wrestling documentary, and it's like the people saying wrestling's fake versus the people sticking up for wrestling, and it's just funny. There's a whole bunch of people defending how wrestling is real, and Captain Lou is one of them. And it's just interesting to go back into that time when people were still defending that it was real, and it was interesting. There's also some interesting things in there where David Schultz is like saying someone might be gay, and like it's
Jim
very
Wilson.
like used in a very derogatory way, and it's like this is a
Mhm,
time capsule from an era that just
mhm.
this type of show would never air now. So it's interesting to watch as a time capsule. But Captain Lou's on there defending that wrestling is real, and he's never heard of any match being choreographed. If it was, it certainly wasn't him involved in anything. But it just shows you they're great workers because they'll go on and they'll like say this with a straight face, and the crowd was actually believing them, and they're hating. Here's the people that probably really were abused. There's one guy talking about the homosexuality with agents and stuff, which turns out to be real. And like
Yeah,
these guys are getting booed, and like these these guys are like getting booed out of the building by the crowd and stuff, and they're saying wrestling's fake and blah blah blah. But it's like no one's gonna believe them because they're not the known wrestlers. But it's interesting that now wrestlers will go on shows, say, "Oh, I really want to work with this person. We'll tell a great story." Blah 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 blah. It really makes me not want to watch it. I find it boring, and it makes the guys look geeky. Whereas in the past, you'd still do it was fake, but you liked that they were trying to like make it pretend that it was real. Like
Bingo.
it just made you
Bingo.
okay. So it's fake, but these guys are
Yeah.
crazy characters that actually
Yeah.
think it's real. I don't know. It was to me it was just so much better. But
Not
yeah.
to mention guys that you wouldn't want to legit mess with. They were tough guys. They were a lot of them were shooters and otherwise badasses. And now I don't think you can say that, especially with AEW and some
Yeah,
of the
and
dudes
there
that
was
are
that,
like
and I'll just touch on this before we get into Heenan. There was that whole thing with Thunder Rosa and AEW. At one point, she was like supposed to be a shooter. It's like in the old days, if someone's not selling for you or something, you're just gonna shoot on them, and it's just the people are just they just want to go by the script and not rock any boats these days. So if something doesn't go by the script, everything is just lost and it looks awkward. They don't know how to like call stuff on the fly to still make things better if it's on the fly. I was talking to Tony Atlas the other day on the phone for like an hour and a half, and just how much better it was to call things on the fly. Now, as Tony was saying, they'll do the same match in every single town, no matter if it's South Carolina or Georgia or Seattle or LA or New York, they'll choreograph the same match. Whereas in the past you would call it on the fly and just go along with whatever the crowd is reacting to. It was more gritty, more realistic. The characters were better. I just have zero interest in watching today's stuff. Like I understand as much as I like The Rock, there was what, a 24-minute promo with The Rock and Cody
oh,
Rhodes. I can't watch
oh,
people talk anymore.
oh.
I'm so bored of the talking. Even if it's The Rock, I don't show me some action. I don't want to hear you talk for 24 minutes. I'm sorry. I love you, The Rock, but I just am so sick of all the talking.
That was horrendous in my opinion, and I agree. People that ask why do you guys talk about stuff that happened 30, 25 years ago, et cetera, et cetera? Very simple reason: it was better. uh to end off, we're going to end on a high note. The man who tops all the lists without a doubt, I 100% agree, and that would be Bobby the Brain Heenan, the gold standard of wrestling managers. What a sharp wit, what a sense of humor. On his feet, he could talk like no other. Impeccable timing, you name it. Managed, of course, a who's who. He had the Heenan family, of course, Andre the Giant, Ric Flair, Paul Orndorff, Rick Rude, who we mentioned, Bockwinkel, Stevenson, the AWA, Mr. Perfect, on and on and on. His ability to generate heat was absolutely unmatched. I, as a youngster, had the opportunity to attend the big event in Toronto, Ontario, and a couple of house shows in Maple Leaf Gardens where he was the manager. And you want to talk about the Hogan pop and how the fans loved him in his heyday. They equally hated Bobby the Brain. What a guy who really elevated talent beyond where they could be. So your opinion of the Brain, Hannibal?
I'll agree. He was the greatest manager of all time. Great talker, great bumper, great commentator. I don't think anyone really comes close. There was some. I mean, I was an Elizabeth fan. Definitely. I mean, she added to Macho Man, but that's kind of a totally different manager. But I would put Bobby Heenan up there as one of the top managers. I won't tell you my Mount Rushmore of managers, but I mean Heenan would be up there for sure. Loved
Do
him
you
managing Mr. Perfect too, and
Yeah,
Andre.
that was a great package. I think we should close by posing this question. Do you think, as we started at the top of the hour here, the program, do you think that the business is suffering by not having managers per se like we used to, or has it just evolved into, as you were talking about a moment ago, something else that isn't pro wrestling, and there's no place for a consistent group of managers anymore.
Well, I mean, in the old days, the managers, what they would be older wrestlers that they would need a job too, right? So they would have to work and be really good in order to be good enough to keep a job, because a lot of people don't want to pay managers. So it's just like it was a lot better in the old days because also you had to draw to make money. If you didn't work real hard to draw or create animosity and stuff to draw, you wouldn't get paid because you were paid off the house. So now pay is guaranteed. A lot of people are paid from training. They don't have to ever learn how to draw. But to me, I don't know if there was a manager good enough to be a manager. Who knows? I may be a manager in the future. I don't know. There's still a use of managers, but is there someone good enough that has enough experience that could be a great manager today? I don't know, but I don't think it has anything to do with the evolution of the business. I just think if one exists and is put with the right person, it could still work. 100% it could still work. I'm sure, and I'm not just saying, I'm going to be wrestling this year, May 3rd and stuff. I'm in training real hard right now, wrestling super crazy. With you managing me at ECW Arena May 3rd, people can go to the 2300 Arena website to get tickets for that for Tri-State Wrestling Alliance One and Done. But I think I could actually be a good manager, honestly. If would it ever happen? I don't know, but I don't think the whole manager thing is dead because I personally think I could be a good manager.
Well, you certainly have the mic skills. The only
Oh, by the way, maybe you could answer this, Jack, because at one point you were talking to Pat Tanaka.
yes, and I just messaged him this week, and I'm hoping to nail that down ASAP. Pat's apparently doing a lot of appearances and whatnot, but I can almost guarantee that we're going to get this done. I really want to get it done. I told him I interviewed his partner, Paul Diamond. He really liked that one. So stay tuned to the Hannibal TV for updates on that situation, but definitely on the top of the list. I just want to say, with respect to managing, I think that perhaps the product has changed to a point where, I mean, Don Callis is still managing in AEW and et cetera, et cetera. I think the product has changed to the point where they could probably look at some of the past and see what managers contributed to the presentation, and there would be more interest. It's just a question of somebody giving them a bona fide opportunity again.
And let's give DDP a mention. He managed Bad Company for a while. Why not? He had the Diamond Dolls, and he started off as a manager. And I do DDP yoga every day, so I really think he's a good guy. So I'll put him over there.
100%, and many interviews with him on thehannibaltv.com. But Hannibal, in terms of the next poll, we keep getting feedback. Thank you from the fans. We'll be putting that up again. I have a feeling.
Tell us in the comments, everybody. Tell us in the comments who you want to see in the next poll, because we will do another one of these.
Absolutely. And stay tuned for our next endeavor, which will be coming shortly, and that's an Ask Hannibal Anything. And make sure that you, as I keep saying, if you haven't already, why not? Why aren't you subscribed to thehannibaltv.com, and make sure you hit that notification button and you'll get all of this content.
420,000 subscribers now. 420. It will never be at 420 again because we're going to keep going up. So if any of you guys are smokers out there, have yourself a light for the Hannibal TV hitting 420. And yeah, for our channel members of the Hannibal TV, we are going to do a special Ask Hannibal and Jack Kilby Anything podcast now on there. And I just bought some more PCW Ultra footage too. So make sure to subscribe to the Hannibal TV because I'll be posting that in the coming days. So I'll let you rack this up, Jack. And anyone that's a member, it's like $1.99 a month on YouTube. Check out the Ask Hannibal Anything podcast. Coming up next.
So fans, thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Hannibal TV Fan Forum. Watch for future polls, and we will see you next time.